Well, more now on those comments from the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, revealing that he was at a wreath-laying ceremony for members of a terror group that killed 11 Israelis at the 1972 Munich Olympics. Earlier, I spoke to Simon Johnson, the CEO of the Jewish Leadership Council, and asked him for his reaction to those revelations.
Well, you have to remember that the brutal murder of 11 Olympic athletes during the 1972 Olympic Games in the Olympic Village was a deeply traumatic event, not just for the Jewish community, but for the entire sporting community and for the world. So when a number of years ago we saw the suggestion that Jeremy Corbyn had been prepared to lay a wreath at a memorial to the perpetrators of that dreadful act, it really made the Jewish community feel very sick. It touched, I think, the rawest of raw nerves.
We've had a tweet from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu come in. I don't know if you're aware of it. He says the laying of a wreath by Jeremy Corbyn on the graves of the terrorists who perpetrated the Munich Massacre and his comparison of Israel to the Nazis deserves unequivocal condemnation from everyone, left, right and everything in between. So that just coming in from Benjamin Netanyahu.
Well, you can tell that feelings are very strong, and the feelings within the Jewish community are equally strong about this, because the perpetrators of this particular horrific crime in the presence, in the eyes of the whole world, was a terrible crime. And for somebody who was even a member of parliament then, now of course the leader of the opposition, to be prepared to honour their memory by the laying of a wreath, I think is an appalling act. It's absolutely worthy of condemnation. But more important than that, Jeremy Corbyn has now had 3 attempts to describe what he was actually doing there. And I don't think anybody who has heard him say, particularly what he said to Sky News today, has got any faith at which version is actually the true version of what he did. Because
he hasn't actually said that he did lay a wreath. He says that he was present at the ceremony and there were various wreath layings occurring, but he hasn't said specifically that he laid that particular wreath.
Well, that's the third explanation we've had, and I think what's causing a lot of concern, not just amongst our community, but amongst the political world in general, is how difficult it is that Jeremy Corbyn is experiencing to actually deal with this issue to everybody's satisfaction. First, he was just generally remembering victims of terrorism, but apparently not the Israeli victims of terrorism. And now today he was present at the wreath laying, but he didn't actually participate in it. I'm afraid being present, in my view, is almost the same as participating. So today's answer is no good either. And I think that what he has to do is to come out. If he's genuinely against all forms of terrorism, then he has to recognise that those 11 Olympic athletes who were brutally murdered in the Olympic Village during the Olympic Games are equally victims of terrorism, and that they should not be memorialised by somebody who aspires to be the Prime Minister of this country.
Hasn't he already said that he is against all forms of terrorism? We've had the Guardian article and the article before that earlier this year in which he said he's completely against all forms of anti-Semitism and terrorism. He's made that quite clear, hasn't he?
No, he has made that clear by his words, but his actions, unfortunately, not just now, but in the very recent past, don't bear that out. If he's against all forms of terrorism, then what on earth was he doing, holding a wreath so close to a memorial for the perpetrators of one of the worst acts of terrorism in sporting history? If you are against all forms of terrorism, then I don't care how long ago this was, you should not have been anywhere near that wreath laying. And if he was, and even if that was in the past, then now as leader of the opposition, he has a duty not to obfuscate, not to try and use sophistry to come up with what he was doing, but to outright apologise for the hurt that his actions have caused.
Do you accept that he wasn't leader of the opposition then, and he was a quite radical, outspoken backbencher, possibly fairly inexperienced on the international stage? Do you accept that he made a mistake?
Well, I mean, this was I think 4 or 5 years ago, so he wasn't an inexperienced backbencher. He'd been in Parliament for over 20 years. I accept that he wasn't leader of the opposition, but he quite clearly aspired to be leader of the opposition. Look, people are allowed to do things in the past that they maybe regret, but at this moment, Jeremy Corbyn is showing no sign of any regret for the action that he took. There are photographs that show him holding a wreath, close to a memorial to the perpetrators of one of the worst acts of terrorism in sporting history, and one that touches an extremely raw nerve with the Jewish community worldwide. So if he feels that it was due to inexperience or he didn't know what was going on, instead of trying 3 times to try and explain what he was doing, he should come out and straightforwardly apologise for his actions.
And would an apology be enough, or do you think he should actually resign?
Look, I haven't had an apology yet, so in terms of that, I think an apology is the very bare minimum. In broader terms, the Jewish community has consistently sought 6 actions on behalf of the leader of the opposition if he really wants to conquer anti-Semitism in his party. I would much rather that he led from the front to ensure that the Labour Party enacted those minimum things that the Jewish community asked for a number of months ago, and made sure that under his leadership that anti-Semitism is conquered within the Labour Party.
Just in a one-word answer, do you think he should resign?
I think that Jeremy Corbyn should apologise for what he's done and should take steps in order to make sure that anti-Semitism has no place in the Labour Party.